you say old man, Mr. Kennedy? It might come as a surprise, but I'm only 20 years old.
I've been waiting 20 years to use that. When we talk about the best years of our lives, those of us that believe in video games think along those terms of the best years in video game history. Our lives and the games that we played during the best times or the worst times are forever linked. 2005 was a great year, if not the greatest year, and a golden era for my generation. At least if you were living in America and participating in first world countries. In other parts of the world, terrorism might have been the operative word.
It's terrorism.
Isn't that a popular word these days?
In 2005, the world was stained by George W. Part 2, so to balance things out, we got Resident Evil Part 4, at least a name. But what we really got was a game that was the first of its kind, one unlike any other before or since. On January 11th, 2005, the first month and second week of around the middle of the decade, we got the Game of the Year, and one of the best games ever made. It's all the more remarkable that Resident Evil 4 released only a month and a half before the other best game ever made, the prequel sequel for Resident Evil's own spiritual successor, the Devil May Cry series, back when Capcom was cooking. It's like beating a dead horse to talk of all the games that came later that could not have been conceived without this gem's shining example. Almost all great achievements owe their origins to someone and somewhere in time. Just as we'd rather pass along the genes that serve a function and not for quirks. Art is about communicating things that can be felt, if not replicated in tandem with the author's vision and a little help from the audience's mindset. In an era of trends and copycats, the most valuable perceived trait is the one that cannot be passed down so uniformly, but one that surely inspires attempts at achieving similar results.
Oh, I believe I forgot to tell you that we gave you the same gift.
Some gifts are so customary that we have lost the point of reference to when they were considered novel. The over-the-shoulder perspective is one of them. On one hand, it's just a small part of the legacy of a true original that its blueprints continue to inform and inspire. On the other hand, perhaps the ultimate goal of life is to spread seeds beyond the horizon and to share the truest source of wealth, ideas, with anyone that has an imagination big enough to hold those surrogate truths and their own experiences together to create something not only new but transcendent. Creativity is an investment in the present as much as it is the future, but for a moment in time, Resident Evil 4 was all that I needed and all that I wanted from a video game. A period piece defined by surreal narrative choices within proximity to equally baffling world events, Leon's eternal aura. And for the technical innovations that remain pristine, I would be content to play it forever. Its authenticity assured is both one of a kind and the lodestar pointing ahead. 20 years later, it ages like fine wine splattered on a canvas. The real Resident Evil 4 is a cultural touchstone that carries on the singular third-person shooter tradition with an impact beyond remakes and remasters and rip-offs in the name of homage.
The most detestable habit in all modern cinema is the homage. I don't want to see another goddamn homage in anybody's movie.
For something to truly age is to show wrinkles where there was once smoothness. But when you're as smooth as Leon Scott and Ada Wong and the rest of the mercenaries, it's hard to notice any creases outside of those that were intended to be there. The tank controls, once standard practice, have entered the status of disrepute as an antiquated feature from an era of design limitations, at least according to the cynics and the revisionists, typically those that never played games from this timeline during it, or perhaps never understood them for lack of trying to engage with it on its terms that are completely acceptable under these fine-tuned conditions. This hallucination that Resident Evil 4's gameplay feels stiff or outdated is a false perception for which I have no sympathy for, at least not for this very specific context in which the controls were implemented not only adequately, but astutely. Of course, a movement system feels more fluid when you have omnidirectional movement. but there's also a reason why gravity works the way it does. The mechanics must be balanced. Every gameplay system has a set of rules and constraints that create a puzzle, a challenge to be solved by player initiative. Of course, you want freedom, but like in life, you cannot have freedom without responsibility, and in video games, responsiveness. If you make a game too easy, it fails to stimulate our need to be challenged. If you make a game too tedious, it won't feel worthwhile as a form of pleasure. Beyond difficulty tweaks to find the sweet spot, the fundamentals of a game's design have to be adapted for all occasions. And what Resident Evil 4 did was satisfy the crowd that wants a scare, and the crowd that didn't know that they wanted to suplex a zombie as well. To excoriate the tank controls in retrospect misses the point about why they remained fashionable across console generations and even genre shifts. To some, those that have been spoiled by the games that came later, they might be seen as cumbersome if viewed from a different design lens. But a better word is consistency. It's a particularly ironic criticism coming almost exclusively many years after the fact, a very narrow-minded observation to focus on one element of a lesser importance to the overall design identity than the one that we owe continued praise for. By the very fact that we continue to use Resident Evil 4's most vaunted innovation as the benchmark in third-person games, of course I'm talking about its camera style. The very style of camera choice arose from the early 2000s contemporary perception of design stagnation, should be enough to assuage any cynicism that the game should have been made in the style of Uncharted or Vanquish thereafter, games that not only did not exist but would have been largely inconceivable without Resident Evil 4 coming first. If Shinji Mikami had wanted to replace the tank controls back then, he might have done so, and he's also the one that took the genre even further when he did make Vanquish. Curiously, the controls were not altered much from their original intended states, although slight improvements like the quick turn feature and 360-degree turn rotation with the red dot used for precise manual tracking make all the difference. The real stagnation of the period was long thought to be due to a lack of style, not substance. Although fixed camera angles limit the scope of where the eyes can look, they do not limit what's in the frame. If anything, they may accentuate it, which is why many of the best action games and certainly the survival horror games from the era made great use of these purposeful restrictions as an artistic choice and to maximize the mode of operation. Action games like cinema are a matter of what's in the frame and what's not, and so is survival horror. What Kamiya understood for Devil May Cry and what Mikami later gleaned for RE4 is that by putting the camera behind the player, we are seeing ourselves as we would if we had an out-of-body experience, but one where we could still see up close and personal, one where we feel like we have direct control over our virtual puppet. Or maybe it just looks cooler, like a reflection of ourselves in the mirror. Pulling the camera in tighter but not too tight, we can see what's around us but also more clearly what we want to focus on, where we want to shoot. This experience feels a lot more methodical, a lot more personal. Even playing at this speed feels like the Goldilocks zone of a tactical playstyle compared to the frenetic but often chaotic and unpredictable energy of latter-day third-person shooters. Resident Evil 4 showed us that there was plenty of room for experimentation in a horror game besides the scripted jump scares in the form of QTEs and reducing the low ammo counts. Moment-to-moment improvisation is what survival is all about. Today, fixed camera is seen as a nuisance, and of course, not every instance of it in older games was the best of fun. It works great for a slow burn game like Silent Hill 2, where you need to stay locked into the unique atmosphere. But to lead the charge towards a new type of experience, one where we could feel like the action hero instead of a passive voyeur, for a more fluid playing experience, we needed to have a loosened grip on the point of view. The controls are still as solid as a tank, still as consistent and reliable as a good AI partner. They were a feature, not a bug, of that era. Although games like Gears, Uncharted, or Vanquish would free up movement and accelerate the pace of play, the feeling of claustrophobia, of intimacy, would be dialed back dramatically in those titles. Resident Evil 4 was about putting tension at the forefront of the experience, the parameters designed around the concept of precision over power. There's an old article entry from Games Radar that I couldn't find today, So here's a screenshot and a bit of prose from someone who might have said it best 10 years ago. These deliberate facets of design are part of an immaculately designed interface. It's a game about forging a tight, tactical insight into one's abilities and surroundings, and funneling that through strategy, improvisation, and organized carnage. Beautifully said. Now, surely other variations on the system work well for what they were trying to accomplish, maybe in a more accentuated gallery shooter predicated on quantity over quality and counter design. And so too does the tank schematic for the action-horror hybrid of RE4. The shame of modern thinking is that every trend is worth chasing, that we must chase off the old way of doing things, for instant gratification of capturing some fleeting popularity for a day. It's the video games that provide the most variety that are the most fun because they allow you to showcase your creativity and personality as a video gamer, which is why so many gamers lionize Devil May Cry and other character action games for giving the player personal freedom. What might have been lost along the lines of survival horror by increasing the ammo count is made up for in spades by a simply improved core combat experience where improvisation is key, and along these lines, where split-second decision-making comes into play, so is tension preserved and personified. The feeling of isolation and impending dread, occasionally interrupted by moments of calm or moments of Ashley, preserves the aura and ambience of horror just fine, the way I see it. Resident Evil 4 certainly boasts the series' most maniacal set pieces and the most batshit overtures to survival scenarios. There's 1,000 ways to die as Leon, and none of them look too comfortable. The game was as brutal and uncensored, at least out west, as they come, and that includes what you can do to the enemy as much as what they can do to you. The talk of the game ruining survival horror is not substantiated by any direct decision made by the game itself, but perhaps it became a talking point later on when Resident Evil 5 exposed how much of lightning in the bottle Resident Evil 4 was at the time. It's lightning that strikes as much as you want it to when you play it, but it's also a reminder that not everyone can follow a simple blueprint when trying to make art. You have to inject the human touch, imbued by integrity and ingenuity. What we need is not the homogeneity, as Yahtzee put it recently in his review of the Silent Hill 2 remake. As he says, the hidden cost of remaking a game is that we lose the insight on the development process and the souls behind the design. As Katsura Hashino, the director of the Persona series, put it, games that give off the vibe of design by boardroom committees and algorithms, and not by passionate developers, are not interesting. It's worth noting that the development cycle for Resident Evil 4 began in development hell, only for the final product to escape hell and to deliver us gaming heaven. It was a package deal with Devil May Cry 3, although the journey that series took parallels Resident Evil and then departs dramatically. It was a long time coming for both games, with Resident Evil 4's early drafts going back way to 1999. With Devil May Cry 1 being the fruit of creative disagreements at Production Studio 4. Both Hideki Kamiya and Shinji Mikami wanted a new camera style and new personality, and they got them. Resident Evil 4 had a bit of a strange release schedule owing to the business deals that Shinji Mikami made for the game's licensing. RE4 was initially released first in the West, almost an entire 2 weeks before the slightly censored version made debut in native Japan. The game was intended to be a Nintendo exclusive, shoving Sony PlayStation to the side, despite the fact that much of Capcom's modern success is owed to the Japanese Megacorp, giving their franchises a home. Reportedly, Mikami was skeptical about the future for companies like Sony and Microsoft, worrying that over time they may become complacent and stagnant. It's almost like our man had a crystal ball because fast-forwarding 20 years, Sony and Microsoft especially still don't have much idea about what their core gaming philosophy is. And to Xbox's eternal ineptitude, they haven't much broadened their horizons since that awful pitch meeting where the godfather of survival horror walked out unimpressed and confused. The amount of power Shinji Mikami had was unprecedented and deserved. Clearly, he was someone that cared more about the future and integrity of the games he made than the quick revenue up front. Capcom is a little different. Eventually, the suits negotiated to get the GOAT to the PS2 just in time for Christmas of that year. Shinji Mikami was annoyed, but I'm sure that the decades of legacy and the financial compensation probably cooled his kettle a bit. Ultimately, this decision was groundbreaking for the industry, and it broke the code of exclusivity to set the standard for all future games, even though we still have console wars to a degree. Video game excellence is something that must be shared. If only we could end the console wars for good with this example. If Resident Evil 4, a certified classic, can be on virtually every device that plays games, why can't everything be shared across the spectrum? It was early 2006 when I discovered the game. It's too long ago for me to remember the order of the Resident Evil games that I played. But I remember enjoying fixed camera for what it was until RE4 showed that a third-person shooter can truly be multidimensional in more ways than just camera placement. It also showed us that video game storytelling can indeed be cinematic without ever needing to sacrifice or to stunt the gameplay progression. Much has been made about the so-called narrative storytelling evolution in video games, the excuse used to absolve lesser game designers that pad poorly constructed systems with cutscene filler. Many so-called game designers would, on their best days, rather be sitting on a Hollywood backlot instead of behind the keyboard making programming magic. Games like RE4 and Devil May Cry 3 not only changed the way the games could be played, but how characters in games could be perceived. Gone was the cringe voice acting and the low-res texture models and shoddy animations that failed to convince us. 2005 saw the rise of peak motion capture choreography and FMV glory. Game graphics had never looked this realistic and action heroes never felt more believable. It's not to say that game characters did not exist before that felt like they belonged exclusively to the medium, but here we had game characters that embraced their advantages to the fullest. An action game hero is supposed to chew the scene, and chew up the zombies and demons too, and spit them right back out. What remakes tend to get wrong is the characterization. Just like it's foolish to pronounce that tank controls were wrong for how they were used, we hear that Resident Evil 4's story is too goofy to take serious. And it is goofy, but it should not be taken as a bad thing. The story of RE4 is serious, but not self-serious or self-indulgent. It's honest about the people that we cannot save. Sometimes you have to make self-sacrifice. It's honest about the actions we have to take for preservation. And speaking of preservation, we need to start getting concerned about protecting the original ideas the best that we can. The original had more substance and, just as importantly, subtext. And here I'm going to tell you that I've never played Resident Evil 2, yet I understood everything that there is to know about Leon's character through the subtext in his narration at the beginning of the game, and his reluctant interactions with the NPCs like Ada and Krauser, a character that never even existed but was retconned perfectly. There's not a better depiction of survivor's guilt in a video game besides maybe the tragedy of Dante and Virgil and the spiritual masterpiece DMC3. I've always said that Leon is very much the video game equivalent of Rick Blaine, a man that was left hanging too many times to count, but would still carry the load as many times as he had to in order to put the world first. He's arguably video game's greatest hero, if not the best character altogether. I know that one of Capcom's 2005 characters must take that title. I've talked about that enough in other videos, but I'll just leave it here that RE4 had it all and it never needed a remake. It's a shame that retroactively Capcom of today decided to register the original domain as Resident Evil 4 2005 in parentheses. The asterisk should not be on the original, but the 2023 remake. How shameful it is that a simple Google search for Resident Evil 4 now tends to bury the original game and coverage of it under the branding of the remake. This is how games are lost to time. Do not entertain foolish arguments that the originals won't be lost to time with remakes when simple games preservation, surely not the priority of game companies, is left to the algorithms and trends to decide what's relevant and what's in the past. I was saying that Resident Evil 4 was the best game since sliced bread, since I came out the womb, not because it appeared on any best of lists, even though it ended up on nearly all of them. I would not have known or cared that it did. To me, it was everything that I could want in a game of its kind, and it's refreshing to see how many other contemporary gamers feel the same way without being told to think that. In 2005, YouTube went from not existing at all to hardly existing, and gamers didn't need anyone else's opinion about what to play. The game was simply mind-blowing. The longevity and replayability speaks for itself. And if you consider games from the same perspective that I do, that is the most important factor of all. The game was a masterpiece from day one, and that has not changed a bit 20 years on. It's a cliche that only happens at the end of my videos. But Resident Evil 4 is a part of me that I can't let go, whether it's 20 years later or 100.
What is it that you fight for, comrade?
My past, I suppose.